Dash Dilek, our today's guest for the In Conversation with Tibettv is a professor of law and international affairs, research scholar, public intellectual, and human rights advocate. He has advocated for political reform and universal suffrage in Hong Kong and around Asia, including Tibet, for more than 2 decades. And as a public intellectual, he has contributed commentary to a variety of international media, and his articles have appeared in leading scholarly journals in law and political science. His books, among others, include Making Hong Kong, China, The Rollback of Human Rights and the Rule of Law. He is Professor Michael C. Davis. Welcome to our show, Professor.
Well, thank you. Yes.
Professor, since you're here in Dharamsala for the past few days, and you have visited Central Tibetan Administration and the few non-governmental organizations here and met a few individuals here. So I would like to know, how do you feel about being in Dharamsala, and what is your purpose of your visit here?
Well, I've been here many times before. One doesn't feel good about some. I mean, you feel good about Dharamsala because the people here seem like they're productive and happy. But then the situation that has them here and what they're trying to deal with is not something you feel good about. But I feel encouraged that, you have to remember that this center here of an exile community has been around for 70 years. So I work with exiles around the world, and very few of them can organize themselves in the way we see here. And so when I visit the CTA and various Tibetan NGOs, I'm very much impressed that there are all this organization is going on. At the same time, I think I sense a heavy frustration, because right now seems to be a sort of moment when there's not a clear direction of what to do, going forward, what to do next. Yeah, so that's something I like to talk about it. I'm a human rights professor. As you introduced me, I do a lot of work on human rights, and I like to understand what's going on, and I had a chance to do that here, and I very much appreciate that.
And coming to your area of expertise, you have you have been teaching law and international affairs and writing on human rights and rule of law, specifically on human in Hong Kong for more than 3 decades, as you said. Yeah. So I just want to know, can you tell us how did that started? I mean, how did the interests in this area come about?
Well, I've been a human rights lawyer even before I came to Hong Kong. I worked as a lawyer for what's called Native Hawaiian Legal Corporation, because I'm from Hawaii. And their indigenous people are always struggling for their rights, and we handled cases to represent them in the courts before commissions and so on to regain their land. Like Tibetans, they have a sort of space here. Tibetans live in settlements and so on, where Native Hawaiians have their homelands, and I would work on those cases. While I was doing that, I was teaching at night at the University of Hawaii, just teach a class. And quite frankly, I kind of liked my night job better than my day job. So then I wanted to teach in a university. And I was searching around. I interviewed some on the US mainland and didn't really want to go over there. And then I heard about a job in Hong Kong where they were looking for somebody who does what I do. And so I showed up thinking I might be there for a couple years, and I was for 30. So I kind of got hooked. Yeah. And I got hooked because the kind of issues we face are the kinds of issues that interest me most, about how societies form democracies, how they create liberal constitutional regimes, and what makes them tick, sort of in the development context. And so Hong Kong was a textbook case of that, because the British, just before I arrived there, had signed a Sino-British joint declaration that promised Hong Kong 1 country, 2 systems, the rule of law, the ultimate aim of universal suffrage, freedom of expression, all the liberal institutional guarantees that one looks for around the world. And Hong Kong had become famous as one of the top countries in the world for the rule of law. And its media had all kinds of media on all sorts of issues. So it was like a laboratory for how to establish basic freedoms in a society. And Beijing had guaranteed that in what was called the Sino-British Joint Declaration. And that Declaration provided for a basic law that it stipulated its content of these things, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I can tell you in those early years, Tibetan people that I spoke to very much wish they could have that one country, two systems model. And that wasn't pie in the sky, because earlier, many, many years before, a 17-point agreement given to Tibet had some of the elements. In fact, we were informed by some Chinese leaders that that was sort of the basis for their agreeing to this one country, two systems model. So, of course, that was taken away from Tibet, and Dalai Lama came here in 1959. But Hong Kong sort of renewed this idea that within this communist country, you could have special zone where autonomy would be maintained. While there had been lots of promises of autonomy for ethnic national minorities in China, that autonomy was never quite real, because it seemed to be more of a tool for national security on China's borders rather than real autonomy. But in Hong Kong, there was real autonomy, at least at the start. And there was an erosion of it over the years, but Hong Kong people were free to go to the street and protest and push back. And we had many protest movements. In 2003, as a human rights lawyer and professor, I was a member of the Article 23 Concern Group. And when Hong Kong government wanted to impose national security laws then, we sat, 9 of us sat in a room, didn't even have windows, I recall, and hatched up this idea that we would inform the public through a series of pamphlets that the Hong Kong people later called the rainbow pamphlets, because we published them, each one in a different color. They're very short and right straight to the point. And by the time we circulated them on the street, there were 500,000 protesters on the street, and the government withdrew this legislative proposal. We don't hear much about national security again until 2020, when Beijing imposed a national security law after the 2019 protests. So this was all the way back in 2003, and then over the years, there were other things. The promised democracy never arrived. Beijing made decisions in these years promising that this model, this universal suffrage, would be achieved. But what they seem to be saying is, oh, we allow universal suffrage, everybody can vote, but we'll determine who the candidates are. So that kind of didn't meet with Hong Kong people's expectation of genuine, fair, and free elections. Mm-hmm. So people would protest. They protested in 2014 over that. Then in 2019, Beijing wanted to impose this extradition law, which would allow Hong Kong people simply to be extradited, to be sent to the mainland to face trial on whatever mainland charges there were. Huge debate. Even some of the business community was worried, because there's a kind of practice in the mainland and local government that if there's a deal, a contract, a business deal, and the mainland side, the local government side don't like it, then they'll accuse the businessman of fraud or cheating or something and try to prosecute him. So this threat to send Hong Kongers across the border, not just Hong Kongers, anybody in Hong Kong, across really hit a raw nerve.
There is a case of 5 people who are booksellers, and they were actually disappeared. And,
right.
It's said that they were critical of the Chinese government or the government in
right.
Hong Kong.
Well, yeah, they were in Hong Kong, and these booksellers, what they were doing is getting these books that mainlanders couldn't buy because of censorship. And in those days, there were a lot of mainland tourists. So they would come into Hong Kong, and there's this free society. I mean, Hong Kong was a tourist destination, especially because it was a free society. It was like, well, I don't have to go halfway around the world somewhere else in Europe or something. I can just go very locally here to Hong Kong, and I'll live in a free society, can turn on the TV and watch anything I want, CNN, the BBC, all of this stuff, and without limits, because Hong Kong, the Freedom Forum had ranked Hong Kong as one of the freest places in the world. And so they would come there, and these booksellers running a business, selling the books that they couldn't get on the mainland, some of them critical or exposing corruption among Chinese leaders. And China, of course, didn't think kindly of that. And so one of the booksellers was snatched off the streets of Hong Kong. Another one was snatched in Thailand. So another had gone to the mainland on a business trip and was snatched. And then they were put on mainland TV in public to confess their crimes. So this again hit a raw nerve. So Hong Kong people, to their credit, understood that if they were going to have freedom, no one was going to give it to them, that they had to guard it themselves. And so there's these periodic protests over all these years, both before and after the handover. And then as we get to 2019, there's a lot of pressure on the Hong Kong government by Beijing and its supporters to finally again try to pass that national security laws. So they thought they'd try an easy one first. Let's get an extradition law. And if that gets through without too much protest, we'll try to up it a bit to national security law. And of course, that was poorly calculated. The chief executive of Hong Kong was out to defend it and saying that she didn't see a big problem with it, but Hong Kong people did. And so by then you get this massive protest emerge, one of the largest protests in the world, 2 million people. And I imagine people in the Tibetan exile community and others, Chinese dissident community, were all watching Hong Kong. It was the new place to watch. And I think they need to study that. You need to study how Beijing's policies reach these peripheral communities, because Beijing's constitution seems to say these communities in Xinjiang and Tibet and Inner Mongolia, Hong Kong and Taiwan would be autonomous. But in fact, Hong Kong had been the only one. And it seemed that the early years, Beijing officials kept their hands off. They used behind the scenes maneuvering. They did appoint their friends and not the opposition. And so the opposition was kept in permanent opposition. It could never, by a kind of structure of the electoral system, it could never, even though it won the majority of votes, it couldn't win the majority of seats in the Legislative Council, and there was no right to elect the chief executive. So Beijing had all the tools to control Hong Kong already, but then they started expanding that, and the promised reform, they drug their heels on it. And so by the time this extradition law was proposed, there was a kind of sense among a lot of the younger activists, and a crop of them had been nurtured in what was the umbrella movement in 2014 and 15, because there they were promoting democracy. So this younger, Joshua Wong and all these people were nurtured in that environment. And so by then, some of the youngsters were frustrated. And I remember when they occupied the Legislative Council, that at one point they put on little stickers on the wall, "You taught us that nonviolence doesn't work," because all the protests in Hong Kong had been nonviolent. And the 2 million people protesting was nonviolent. The 1 million the week before was nonviolent. But it seemed almost like Beijing's supporters wanted to stir up violence almost, so then they can crack down.
The Hong Kong government has passed a national security law on 30th June 2020, as you have mentioned earlier, which has given Beijing governments more authority on judicial matters in Hong Kong. And similarly in Tibet, Chinese government often arbitrarily arrests Tibetans on the charges of disrupting social order, calling them separatists, or inciting state subversions for simply calling for the human rights and freedom. And can you tell me what similarities and differences that you see when it comes to such laws between Tibet and Hong Kong by the CCP, and what all does national security law covers?
Yeah, well, it covers, as I mentioned, those crimes of collusion. One is collusion now becomes almost any interaction with foreigners. And I've, in the past in my life, I've been in Tibet, I've been in Xinjiang, all over there in my research as a scholar. And I found that when protests arise, they're always blamed on foreigners, people in foreign locations. It could be, by that, they include here in India. And I think that's what's going on there as well. Now, the one thing that distinguishes the Hong Kong national security law that Beijing imposed is, while the mainland law applies in China, the Hong Kong one applies worldwide. So people who are in exile, who are engaged in lobbying governments and so on, because then they're accused of collusion when they testify in parliamentary bodies, US Congress, wherever, the UK, the European Parliament and so on, they're accused of collusion, and those people are targeted. Some of them have warrants against them for arrest, some of the most prominent ones. The list isn't long, and one doesn't know if you're a Hong Konger who has joined in the diaspora community to try to promote basic freedoms in Hong Kong. You don't know, in most cases, whether you've been targeted. And people worry about their families back in Hong Kong. So they pretty much, when they go into exile, and a lot of them are younger people because they were involved in these last protests, which was dominated by the young Hong Kongers. They basically have to cut off contact with their families because they don't want their families put under pressure. So the Tibetan community in exile experiences all the same things. So this is a similar thing. What probably distinguishes it is Hong Kong is one of the world's leading financial centers. And, you know, while Beijing doesn't care whether anybody relies on the courts in Tibet or Xinjiang, and those courts, no one does rely on them, in Hong Kong, they still pretend to have one country, two systems, and that they're adhering to it, they claim. And they try to claim that the courts are still independent. And so structurally, the courts appear to be independent. They're common law courts. And so there's a big question for international investors is, are those courts okay in the commercial area so we don't worry about human rights? And it's hard to say. But what happens there and what is different, because the courts in the mainland are controlled by the government, the Beijing. The ones in Hong Kong are pseudo-independent. And what happens is pressure is put on them. So when protesters are arrested, if the court dismisses the charge, then the communist papers attack the court. And some of the judges might be moved. Now, the national security law has provisions that really are important in this regard. One is it says only designated judges can hear national security cases. And that just not under the national security law, but even an existing colonial sedition law, which India also inherited, that any of those cases are considered national security cases. So there's a list of national security judges that the government trusts to be favorable to the government, I guess. And so only those guys can hear it. And at the same time, the national security law sets up a committee for safeguarding national security that's chaired by the chief executive of Hong Kong and made up of cabinet members and police officials and so on. And that committee is advised, in quotes, by a Beijing official who runs the local liaison office. But most people expect, when they look at that there's more than advice here. It's supervision, in effect. But that's not all. Beijing also set up an office for safeguarding national security, and that is made up entirely of mainland public security officials, the same kind of officials you would see in Tibet. Okay, they're there, and both of these offices are not subject to judicial review. So they can do pretty much what they want, and the committee issued regulations that allows warrantless searches and everything and surveillance. And so what people imagine is the Beijing Public Security Office is probably talking and I should add, there's a special unit of the police now on national security and a special unit of the Justice Department on national security. And so what one imagines, and you don't know because it's opaque, it's not open to public scrutiny, is that these mainland officials, if they identify something that concerns them, they will convey it to the local officials that are in these bodies that are not subject to judicial review. So this raises concern. One point recently, one of the top officials was bragging how they're winning every single national security cases. Bragging, that's a 100% score. He apparently didn't realize that if you're getting 100%, that's maybe a sign that there's problem, right, with independence of the court. So all of this is going on, and the international community is watching. The Human Rights Committee wrote a scathing, because Hong Kong is under the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, wrote a scathing report on Hong Kong, attacking all of this stuff. So in the past, they tried to tiptoe around Hong Kong because Beijing was more or less doing it, but controlling a lot, but at least people could protest and there were free press and so on, rule of law. Now that stuff's under attack, and this committee attacked it severely. So this is what's going on now. And in the international parliaments, there used to be special status for Hong Kong under one country, two systems. Now the United States has withdrawn that. Beijing had gone to the capitals of the world to ask countries to treat Hong Kong separately from the mainland. And now the countries around the world, many of them, have withdrawn that special treatment. So the international community is engaged, and so are all these issues going on in Hong Kong. But on the ground, a lot of silence because people can't speak. So you have to kind of speak from overseas. And I think this is why a lot of the exile communities from Tibet and otherwise interact with each other, because now they face a similar kind of problem. Because human rights work, at the end of the day, if you can't change what's going on the ground, what you can do is publicize it. And that's what human rights work is. Researching it, writing it up, taking it on into the media, reporting on it, publicizing it where you can, approaching parliaments and political bodies to also issue statements and criticisms, so that publicizes it even more, getting national leaders to draw attention to it, and so on. That's the work of human rights. And now that same kind of model, in effect, has to apply to Hong Kong, as has long applied to Tibet, and also to Xinjiang, to the Uyghur community. So these are the kinds of problems that people face, and these are the strategies that, you can see being used, and the similarities that are occurring. Yeah.
Okay, and as you have talked about right now, just before, with the arrest and adjudication of the pro-democracy leaders in Hong Kong, and there is a danger of having a leaderless movement going on, right? And also the discussion on political discussion is kind of ever shrinking in Hong Kong. Right. So with all this, it's because of the massive surveillance and policing state in Hong Kong, right? Also in Tibet. Yeah. So do you find hope in democracy in China with all this happening?
Well, right now I don't have much. I think the current government has a view. When you think about national security in China, and you ask yourself, why is China so attentive to national security? I think it's because the Chinese government, in particular the Communist Party, views the biggest threat to national security to be the people of the country, and including the people of these peripheral communities, okay? They see that as the biggest threat. And so what is the character of that threat? It tends to be liberal ideas like democracy. So they issued documents years ago, almost a decade ago, they issued a document called Document Number 9, which forbids professors and teachers from even talking about constitutionalism, free speech, separation of powers, human rights, Western notions of human rights, the rule of law. They're not supposed to talk about it at all. And recently in speeches, Xi Jinping has emphasized his concept of a national security is a comprehensive one. So almost all areas of social activity, not just political statements, but all areas of social activity have national security dimensions. And why is that such an expansive national security now? It's more expansive than it's ever been. It's because they view ideas as the biggest threat to national security. The very ideas that the Tibetan exile movement talks about, that Hong Kongers were talking about in 2019, and so on. And that's it. And so if you look at it, you could say the number one concern of the Communist Party is liberal constitutionalism, that these ideas, which includes free speech and separation of powers and all that stuff, that's what we mean by liberal. These are the ideas that the Communist Party sees as a threat. And Xi Jinping has drunk the tea. He really takes these as the most serious concerns, and he's shown a willingness to be tough on it. And he's even expanded it he's even issued statements on its expansion into international affairs. And he has these so-called wolf warrior diplomats who go out and bully other countries who call Beijing out on these things. Recently, Canada, this week even. So it's not stopping. And so the impression you get, and he's made himself president for life, not just president, but general secretary, which is the most powerful position in the Communist Party and in China. He's made himself that for life. And so at the moment, I think there's not an opportunity to really deal with the communist government in China, either for Tibetans or exiles. They're not going to get a hearing from those people, and they're going to be under constant pressure, which very much reaches overseas globally. And so that means if you're going to think about a brighter future, it's probably a time to step back and ask other things you can do, such as training members of your community, both with professional skills and education. And we had discussions about education because I'm affiliated with the Jindal Global University, so we had discussions of that. Because if there are more members of your diaspora community with not just working for the CTA in official roles, but also people that are prominent people in the country where they live who have a voice and can shape that effort to look for opportunities in the future to work with China in ways that are more constructive. So having members of the diaspora with multiple talents is, I think, this is a time to focus on that, because I don't think there's a lot of room for just negotiating. If you negotiate over anything now, you're probably going to get nothing. And that's the problem. So right now, I think it might be a time for renewal, because there's a whole new generation. And maybe this generation may have more opportunities to build, because democracy is threatened around the world, and to be a part of that. And they're going to be a part of it in various ways. And this is the kind of things that I talk about with my Hong Kong colleagues in the community. I talk about with the media. I've talked here with your officials that deal with education and training and all these things. That I think the notion right now should be to focus on building this kind of community. And it includes values, because you don't want people just going to, get professional skills so they can get rich. Fine, make a good living, don't be poor, but also have values that are useful for the community and good for the community. So I think all of these things are things that are probably a better focus at the moment. And then working on the problems that exile communities have. Because there are a lot of problems. When people live in exile, they miss home as one thing, but they also feel vulnerable. They function often as a minority. They may have lost their financial base, which they might have had at home, and they have to try to make their way in the world. So scholarships and foundations and others can be helpful in this as well. And having a talented group of people that can talk to these organizations and to the media to promote a cause of an exile community, of a diaspora community, I think that's kind of where the action's at the moment.
Okay, and before I sign off with this discussion, supposing that democracy stand a chance in China, and it actually realizes and it happens, would that be a boon or a ban or a mix of that to the issue of Tibet?
I think it could be, it can't get any worse for the Tibet issue. So it has to be a positive thing. The people sometimes worry, there's a theory, it's in political economy, that if a country becomes sufficiently wealthy, there's a kind of tipping point where the population will no longer tolerate an oppressive regime. So the tipping point means that's what happened in South Korea. That's what happened in Taiwan. The people took to the streets and overthrew that. We saw some elements of that dissatisfaction when people protested over the zero COVID policy in China. So the Chinese mainland people are not asleep. They know that these problems occur, and they like freedom like anyone else, but then they've drunk the tea because they don't get information like you and I do. So they kind of are taught in every way that the Beijing government can to believe that this path they're on is the best path for them. So whether there will be a tipping point, I even have in one of my courses, has China defied gravity? That somehow it's, while everyone else, when they get richer, start having political reform. Will China? Okay, once you get past that tipping point and you get leadership, and they had it sometimes in the past, Deng Xiaoping was sort of a liberalizing character. If that emerges again in the future, people sometimes worry, well, they will still, be all this nationalist politics, and they won't be sensitive to peripheral communities and so on. So it becomes a political project to raise these sensitivities, and I think that's something can even be done now to the extent that information is put out in the international discourse. So that would be the project of it. And then the Tibet community as a whole, if it were an emerging democracy, would have to decide whether it wanted to be a part of that or whether it wanted to have a separate status. And even myself years ago, I wrote an article on the case for Chinese federalism. It could be that China in a democratic character could emerge as something like Europe with, a community that works together on its economic benefits and trades within itself, and it sets up rules on trade. Europe started out as just a coal and steel community, but it expanded into something more significant and kept adding to it as trust was built. So that's the problem right now, and I think that will be a problem in the future, is having trust within this Asian community. And Asia is the only part of the world that doesn't have like a regional human rights treaty. So Asia itself, not just China, has a long way to go in sorting out these issues of trust with its neighbors and so on. But I would think a democratic China could be a more trustworthy partner, but it would be a challenge. But I think it's a challenge worthwhile.
Thank you, Professor Michael, for your time and sharing your insights on these various issues. Thank you so much.
I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you so much.